question of the day. So what is VO2 max? Does everybody know what VO2 max is? It looks like a fairly healthy audience here. It's the volume of oxygen you can consume, usually expressed in either liters per minute or milliliters per minute of oxygen. Usually in relative terms, we divide through by a person's body weight to try to make it comparable to people of different size. Obviously, if you're a large person, you'll consume more oxygen per minute than a smaller person. Kind of in the same regard, if you're a male, usually you consume more oxygen per minute than a female does, largely by size, but also percent body fat makes a difference in there. When we think about how the importance of measuring your oxygen consumption comes into play, you kind of have to look at what the actual measurement is talking about. So oxygen that you can consume, how much oxygen, how much air, because the air is made up of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. How much of that oxygen can you take in? Well, you got to breathe it in from the room air. And then how much of that air that comes through your system, the oxygen component, can you extract from what you had in the air to start with? So, all of these systems play into this whole thing. The skeletal muscle is where you're going to be extracting that oxygen out. How you get it in, the lungs, the bloodstream. How many red blood cells do you have? That binds the oxygen and allows it to carry around. So you have to have some of those. Another reason why women are usually less in a number for VO2 max than men. They don't have as many red blood cells. How well your heart is functioning, and this is where the fitness component comes into play, and the correlation between VO2 max and cardiovascular disease. Your circulation, if you've got clogged up arteries, you're going to be in trouble getting that blood around. And those arteries won't dilate to allow more blood to come through. That's all under the control of your endocrine system and your autonomic nervous system. So those things all come into play. So it's a very good marker for your whole body fitness level. Your ability to extract oxygen out of the room air. So that didn't quite work, I'm sorry to say. It's just a little bit, I think it's too light of a slide. It's a diagram which I was trying to show the connections between measuring oxygen consumption and the way we actually do measure it in the lab. The way we do it is through open circuit calorimetry, which is breathing with a little face mask on. I don't know if any of you ever seen pictures of somebody with this whole headgear on, and it's all attached to a metabolic cart to measure those differences. So we'll forget that. This slide is to remind me to tell you about the connection between what we do in the lab as far as exercise physiologists and what goes on in the medical field. And that relationship between physical fitness and health. And it has recently been determined, and it is considered the measurement of VO2 max to be the ultimate measure of your fitness, of your cardiovascular system. So we've been doing this all the time in the XPhys lab, and primarily doing it on athletes, trying to talk to them and figure out how much oxygen they can consume. High-end endurance athletes at a young age, somewhere in the 60s, 60 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body weight per minute. That's a lot of ability to suck that oxygen out of the air and out of your bloodstream. Versus someone who's just had a heart attack and can't really extract any of that oxygen, doesn't have the heart muscle to push the blood around, any of those things, they may have a maximum number of 10, which is about what you need to be able to get up and walk around the room. So this is something that they use when someone is recovering from a cardiovascular incident where they had a heart attack. One of the things they actually do is see if they can get up out of the bed. They're going to have to get themselves up off of the toilet. They're going to go back and live alone. So we measure these things in the lab. And now they use it as well in the health-related field. They're both connected. And it's largely because of the cardiovascular component to the whole thing. Okay, we look at fitness, we look at aerobic capacity, look at power output, or work capacity, another way to talk about all these things. So kind of the easy way to say it, the best your body can do. This determines your engine, how much energy you can actually produce to do an activity. So again, saying the engine size of the human body is a really nice, simple way to say that statement. One of the nice things that came out of the risk factor, American Heart Association risk factors and the NIH statements, when they actually put the fact that if you are an unfit person, that is as much as a detrimental thing to your physical health as smoking, being obese, having a family history. Being physically fit protects you in a lot of ways. So this is one of the things that you can actually measure, and again, the most vital of all your vital signs. This slide shows you the different ranges, starting from a resting metabolism. Again, we're back in that milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body weight minute. Starting out at the low end, 3. That's resting metabolism. That's what you guys are doing right now. That's what your VO2 is. Considered to be 3.5 mils of oxygen per kilogram body weight. And if somebody has had a heart attack or again really deconditioned, they may be down there as close to their maximal situation. Whereas, again, when you go all the way up to the elite end for males and females, again, females being a little lower, but you can get values up. That measurement, I believe, is a cross-country runner, or a cross-country, skier, thank you, a cross-country skier. And for some reason, the Scandinavians have very high numbers. I don't know if they calibrate their equipment the way we do. I'm not really sure, because I've never measured somebody at 97. The highest I've ever seen is about 73, and that was one heck of a triathlete. But it is indeed considered one of the best measures of physical fitness, and as a result, health. If we look at the different sports that actually are associated, again, that cross-country skier is the one that's up there on the high end, and different sports. Soccer is another big one. As you can imagine, there's a lot of running up and down the field, and all the other aerobic activities. So whole body rhythmic movements are the things that will give you the highest number. In this country, that's usually, we do our tests on a treadmill. We don't usually use a bike unless it is someone who is trained on a bicycle. You're not going to be able to push somebody who doesn't know how to bike to the level of max. And I think maybe Steve will talk about that a little bit, some of the limitations as well as some of the good things. Yeah?
Explain why certain activities lend themselves to higher numbers.
Sure. The more muscles that you use in that activity, the more oxygen you're going to have to consume. So when you look at cross-country skiing, you're using all of your lower body as well as your arms to push off the snow, versus, too far, sorry. You do the same kind of thing when you're rowing. Go back here. But you won't be using it the full range of motion that you are when you're doing cross-country skiing. And if you look at swimming, swimmers usually don't use their arms much at all, or they'll usually tell you that it's not a full body activity. You'll end up using one part of your body more than the other. So that's the basic kind of claim about it. It's how much muscle mass you actually use for that activity. The similar things are true for women. And what happens as we go through your lifespan, on average, you go down about 1% your VO2 max every year that you're alive. Certainly, if you're a trained athlete, when you start out, meaning in your 20s, 30s, you start at a higher point. So even though you're declining as you continue to age, you're still doing a lot better. And that would be another kind of indicator. We usually look at a certain level of VO2 that you need to be at as kind of your max capacity. You get below that and now you're going to be incapacitated. So if you start at a higher level, you're not going to cross that threshold line until a much later time point in your life. So you want to be physically fit when you start out and try to continue to keep it there. But everybody, no matter what, no matter how hard you train, no matter what you do, you're still going to have a decline as you age. Just the nature of the beast as we continue to go down. So when we come down the different age groups, and these are the average numbers here on the right, the 46 going down to 29 in your 70s. Yeah.
When these data are collected, are they all run on a consistent test? Like, are all of these from a treadmill test persons?
No.
Okay. So when the cross-country skier was tested, they were cross-country skiing, and they were engaging all of those muscles at that time.
That's the best way to do it. Absolutely. But most of them usually are done on a treadmill. It depends. To do one on a cross-country skiing situation like that, you need to have a portable apparatus.
Yeah.
So they make these pieces of equipment, and that would be the best way to measure someone doing that kind of an activity. But we usually, for standardization, take those people and put them all on the same kind of treadmill, using similar kinds of equipment to measure the oxygen consumption. But the best way to do it would be doing the actual activity. No, go ahead.
So it looks like here cyclists on average get lower scores than cross-country skiers. So does that higher score for a cross-country skier correspond to better health outcomes for people who are specialists in those sports? Like, do they live longer or healthier lives?
That correlation. I'm sorry?
Is there a max point beyond which you don't have extra health?
Yeah, there is, actually. When you look at the total data for the health benefits associated with maximal oxygen consumption, the person who has the highest VO2 max isn't going to live the longest. That's not a set thing. But those measurements would give you a little bit of protection from heart disease because you have a better system to go. And hopefully that person can actually continue to exercise for a longer period of time than someone who isn't as physically fit, and as a result will reap the benefits a little bit longer. Again, the same patterns for women.
So from that chart standpoint, can you include that cross-country skiing is better for you, or can get you into a higher level of health?
I would say so. Assuming you have there's a lot of genetic components to a lot of these things, but those individuals are definitely the ones who have the highest levels that we've seen.
Health or VO2 max?
VO2 max.
Yes.
Not health.
Right.
VO2 max.
Well, but then your title,
There's a correlation.
so there's a correlation. So if I can get my VO2 max number higher, and somewhat
Imply that you have a better health, but not necessarily that you're going to live longer because of that. There's so many other things that play into that measurement of VO2 max. Your genetic makeup is the big one.
If you could hold off that question a bit, because I think there's some data coming up later that we'll talk about it, but I think in simple terms, it's asymptotic, that after a point, you don't get incremental health benefits. So all the health benefits come at the lower end of the scale, but as you kind of go into the athletic level, then the incremental thing, other things start to matter much more than necessarily a VO2 max.
So here are the different components that we talk about when we, as I mentioned early on, looking at aerobic capacity. That's the measurement that we can tie physical fitness as well as health benefits together. Looking at the cardiac output, again, the leading cause of disease in this country, cardiovascular disease. And so whatever you can do to help that. So again, we're looking at cardiac output, which is the product of your heart rate times the stroke volume. The stroke volume is how much blood your heart can pump every time it beats. So as you could guess, a large person has a larger heart. Every time their heart squeezes, they can push out more blood. And then what your heart rate is, multiply those two together to get cardiac output. And then you go to the amount of oxygen those muscles can take up. So that's going to be dependent upon how big the blood vessels are to allow more blood flow to go to the working muscle, and how small it is to go to the muscles that aren't working. So you can increase the amount of flow specifically to the muscles that need it whenever you're doing that activity. And then you multiply those two together to come up with your VO2, or aerobic capacity. And here's the equations for those of you that like equations and engineer kinds of things. VO2 is equal, in the abbreviation for cardiac output is a large Q. Anything that has that dot over the center, it means that it's a minute volume, or it's a rate. So liters per minute, anything per minute, VO2. And then the AVO2 difference is the amount of oxygen you're extracting from what's found in the arterial blood versus what's left on the venous side. So how much you can actually suck out of that blood as it goes through. And there are many ways to look at it, but the easiest one down there at the bottom is looking at transport and then your ability to suck that oxygen out. How much flow and how much oxygen the muscle can actually take in and extract. So again, tying this back to cardiovascular disease and the American Heart Association. A number of citations, quotes from various citations. The most important overall correlate to health, strongest predictor of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality, meaning when you look at everything else that people die from, not even just cardiovascular disease, and look at all-cause mortality, you can look at VO2 and get a correlation between those parameters. And all adults should have cardiorespiratory fitness, or a VO2 max, measured on a regular basis, which is a nice idea, similar to any other preventative kind of service that we give. We always take your heart rate when you walk into the doctor's office. They do your blood pressure, those kinds of things. The initiative that is called Exercise is Medicine started to ask your physicians to ask you what you do for exercise whenever you come in for your normal visits. That was based on this kind of data, saying that folks who have a higher VO2 have less trouble in their life as far as death or cardiovascular disease. Just trying to make it understood by individuals that, yeah, health is important, fitness is important. It correlates very highly with this. This is a valuable thing to measure. Back in 2001, this review paper, it was a huge conglomerate paper put together looking at all of these different studies and doing a meta-analysis of that data. And so what you're looking at here is the relative risk of a person having a heart attack versus the percentage of VO2, or their fitness level. And so that depending on which study it was, they tried to make a correlation between just being physically active, which is the top line with the open circles and the little dots, versus being physically fit. And so your risk of dying from a heart attack, so they let everybody start there at 1, somebody who doesn't do any kind of exercise whatsoever. If you'll notice how big that drop is, before you get to the lowest percentiles there on the bottom, 25%, so the lowest quadrant of individuals that were tested in all of these studies. You've got a huge drop in risk. If you're just doing something, you've got down to, I'll go 58%. So drop from 1.0 down to 58, so you've got a 40% increase in your ability to not die straight out from these things. That first 10% is really where you see a big change. Just getting people to move, do something. Then when you start talking about individuals going up in their fitness levels, you really start to see kind of it gets to a point and then it starts to just go linear decrease all the way down obviously anybody above the 75th to 100%, there isn't any change as far as their risk is concerned. So this kind of speaks to your question. Yeah.
I'm just curious what they mean by physical activity there, just because it doesn't even come close to the drop. It's just they mean like going on a 1 block clock or?
The definition of physical activity is that you're moving above rest, basically. You're not, it's not a coordinated, it's not an exercise program, just being physically active. So, a person who drives their car, I'll just take myself for example, to the BART station, but I walk from my car to the parking lot and I put it out there at the furthest point it can be so I get some more steps in, get on BART, stand during the ride to Daly City, get out there, and then we'll walk from Daly City to the campus. I'm being physically active, but I'm not training. I'm not looking at the American College of Sports Medicine guidelines and following those. I'm not exercising at a minimum of 30 minutes at a heart rate at a certain level. That's what the physical fitness stuff is. Structured exercise program to enhance your cardiovascular system. But I don't consider myself sedentary, even though I do sit some during the day during my office and so forth. I'm physically active.
Your
But-
risk of one is pretty like lying in bed all day. Like,
Well, not
Driving.
quite that, yeah, not quite that bad, but you're right. It's not doing anything, pretty much. And then different gradations of being physically active. And some of these studies were studies that didn't actually measure VO2 max. Most of them did, especially the ones in the physical fitness category, but the ones in the physical activity or survey data, questionnaire data, and asking people what they do every day, kind of a thing. So you see a big difference between the two, but in general, the trend is the same. The more either physically active or physically fit you are, the much decrease in your risk of having any incident from heart disease. And that's kind of the bottom line. Up there on top, if you collate the data, a 10% increase in VO2 max can lead to about a 15% decline in your risk of having a heart attack.
I understand that big drop in the physical fitness part, from the 1 down to the 0.6. What's happening there?
That's going from doing absolutely nothing to starting to do something. So you can get that much of a drop, almost a 40% decrease in your risk of having a heart attack by doing something.
Obviously not the physical activity, but physical fitness.
Correct. Yeah.
What would be the minimum to achieve that?
For physical fitness or for physical activity? Oh, the minimum amount for that is considered to be doing at least 2 to 3 days a week of low intensity kind of activities. So let's say you went out for a walk 2 or 3 days a week for 30 minutes, but you didn't get your heart rate much above 120, 130, very low intensity kind of exercise. So you're doing something and you're training and you've got a 40% drop in your risk of heart disease, but you could get a lot more if you just upped your intensity a little bit more and increase your fitness level. And again, they measured VO2 max in most of those cohort studies, and they large numbers around each one of these things. So there's a good argument to talk about physical fitness. Same thing is shown for changes in blood pressure with an increase in VO2 max. Just looking at individuals that have high fitness levels versus low fitness levels. So high is the blue one down on the bottom there, and low fitness level, the top line, the green line along the top. So we always think about systolic blood pressure 120, 80 over 120, 80 being your diastolic, 120 being your systolic, and that's a number we worry about. So we drew a line across the 120. When do you cross that point for systolic blood pressure? If you're low fitness, it's happening at about 42 on average. If you have a high level of fitness, we're not seeing that until you hit 60. So it's giving you about 20 years of protection from having a risk of having high blood pressure, giving you a delay in having to take that medication to go along with low blood pressure. There are plenty of other diseases associated with an increase in fitness. And a few of them are listed here. If you have a moderately high VO2 max, so anything over 41 for men, 36 for women. Type 2 diabetes. That goes along with the levels of obesity. Cognitive function, and these are tests that have been done in the psychology groups. The brain from shrinking, having some kind of stimulation going on, and exercise does stimulate the brain, whether we think about jocks as not having good brains or not. It does. When we look at different school things, and that goes along with the success on exams, depression, high correlation between fitness and depression, your resting metabolism, and again, reducing certain cancers. And there's lots of evidence now specifically for breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and prostate cancer. Higher fitness level, your risk of getting any one of those is actually decreased. So this last slide will take you on into the next two presenters actually, looking on how you can actually improve your VO2 max. For a long, long time it was thought that you pretty much, if you did a good max test, which isn't an easy thing to do, you've got to really be driven and want to do this hard and go until you can go no more, hence the name max. You can't really improve it as much. Someone who's a very low fitness level, yeah, you can get big improvements. And that's because they have a lot of potential there. But if somebody's trained most of their lives, you're probably not going to get a huge increase in VO2 max. And some of the work that the group here, that Siva and the folks with Rebo have done, they actually did a little training study for a couple of weeks on folks that were in their lab and had them train every day, high intensities, to see what they could possibly do, measure their VO2 max before and after the training, and they got on average about a 7% increase, which is a really good number. That's a high increase in VO2 max compared to what a lot of studies do if you don't start with really low fitness people. High-end person, you're not going to get a big change, as you can guess. They're already at the top of where their abilities are, and you're not going to really be able to push it a lot more. But he will tell you more about how that worked and what kind of information they had to do, train with when he gets up and speaks. Any questions? Happy to answer. Yeah?
So you said what activity level was at around 25? What was that around 80 where it took it off? Or the fitness levels?
Those are individuals that are exercising at the higher end of their intensities. So they're now working out, I use the heart rate of about 120, 130. They're trying to exercise fairly close to what their maximal capacity is, and they're doing that 3 times a week. So if you're doing a popular kind of training mode now is the high intensity interval training, where you do both. You kind of do a relaxed set first, and then you go as hard as you can for a good 2 minutes, and then you kind of come back down. That's been able to show to see increases in fitness level very quickly.
So just maybe say an hour 3 times a week, is that 80% of the?
If you're not going to be able to do an hour at 80%.
Okay.
If you're going to do an hour, you're probably at 50% if you're fairly well trained. And you'll get some changes. Certainly you'll be at that 50% range. But
More about intensity.
more about intensity. It's more about intensity. And that kind of, we're coming into the realization of that more in the last 10 years. You know, I like to go in the hills and hike with my dog. The intensity isn't really there for that, to be perfectly honest. My heart rate stays right in the 110, 120 range. But then when I hit the hills, then it goes up. So I need to have more and more hills and the whole thing going on. Or try to go faster. Start running instead of hiking. So get the intensity up somehow to get that heart rate to have to increase. Thank you. Any other questions? Turning it over to Tim. Oh, you're going to introduce him first.